So good morning and welcome back to the last day of Radiodays 23. Hopefully the best day of all. I hope you had a really good evening last night to the party. And remember to get coffee at the different places out here during the day. Now it's all about numbers and research here in track 3. And to introduce and tell more about the panel is Mr. Radiodays, Peter Niegel. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Karen. I know nothing about that, but okay. So you guys are the luckiest one. You've chosen the right session. This is going to be the best session of the whole conference, but you know that, otherwise you wouldn't be here at this ungodly hour. I don't know when you got up this morning or when you went to bed last night, but I hope you are relatively fresh of mind and ready to go, because this is going to be very, very interesting. We have two really good researchers with us today. Tom Webster, sounds profitable, he's speaking second. My very dear colleague, Malene from Danish Radio, Kaasgaard Christiansen, she will speak first. Both of them, I was down at the dock, they just unloaded new research. I haven't seen some of it yet, so this is going to be really new for all of us, so I'm really looking forward to this. First of all, Malene, who's an analyst at the DR Analyst Department in Danish Radio. She will be presenting a study I've been a little bit involved with, yes, on the use and preferences among Danish podcast listeners. Then we'll hear from Tom afterwards. Bear with me here, it's a very long and very difficult title. On where podcasting buy sits in the funnel and how it provides a different additive benefit for advertisers. I'm Danish, Tom. I don't know these fancy words. It all sounds very fascinating. Let's hear from Malene first. Thank you, Malene.
Good morning, everyone. You can hear me? This is on? Yeah, sure. Great. Well, as Peter mentioned, my name is Malene. I am an audience researcher with DR, which is the Danish National Broadcasting Corporation. I'm here today to share with you some recent insights from the Danish podcast market. A couple of years ago, my colleagues, Rasmus Kiel, presented here at Radiodays Europe a study that he had conducted with Peter Niegel, who you all already know. He presented a study and some insights from a large survey that we conducted with the Danish podcast listeners. And just recently we conducted the same survey, tweaked a little bit here and there, but these are the insights that I want to share with you guys. Oh, the clicker. There. So, how did we collect this data? Well, we asked a representative amount of Danish people in the age of 15 to 64 about their use of podcasts. 2,000 people were asked, and they replied, 1,000 of them replied that they use podcasts at least monthly. And this is, well, our target. The at least monthly users are our podcast users. And for these users, we sought to uncover how and how often, why people use podcasts in their everyday life. And we asked them about their preferences regarding content, regarding user situations, and as well as platforms. So, these are our key insights. DR Sound, which is our own platform, has grown since our previous study in early 2020, but not at the same rate as the market. More Danish young people listen to podcasts today. However, they need more content, according to themselves. Podcast is still a habit medium as of today, where the users search for this perfect match in their everyday life with regards to both user situation as well as preferred content, which is some insights that we already know from the 2020 study. We also see that the podcast as a medium has matured with the Danish listeners, especially when comparing this data from 2020. And the Danish listeners have very similar needs as they did 2 or 3 years ago. They're just a lot more. They have a lot more strong opinions about these parameters that's important to them. So let's start with the Danish market. Who are the users of today? Well, the Danish podcast user have no specific gender. We found that the gender distribution was 50-50, where a couple of years ago there was a slight male overweight. And compared to the demographics of the Danish people, not surprisingly, the podcast user is a bit younger than average, meaning that the medium has a higher reach with a young audience compared to the more mature segments of the Danish population. Most of the Danish listeners also say that they spend approximately around 1 to 4 hours on an average week listening to podcasts, which is actually a bit less than we suspected. However, with these insights in mind, we created 3 central user segments from the Danish population. First, the largest segment, which we call the light users here, are 38% of all listeners. They listen occasionally, and they listen for less than 2 hours on an average week. Then we have the medium segment. This medium segment is 37% of the users. They listen regularly, every week, and for approximately 2 to 4 hours on an average week. Finally, we have the heavy segment, which is 1 out of 4 of all listeners. And these users mostly listen daily and for more than 4 hours on an average week. And we were actually very surprised that the heavy segment was not larger than it is. And something that also surprised us was, let's see here, that, of course, we thought that the younger the audience, the more likely they were to steer towards the heavy segment, but apparently our core listeners are really the young adults and the adult listeners. It's not surprising that the mature segment in the age of 47 to 64 are more likely to steer towards the light segment. However, the light segment is actually primarily consists of young listeners in the age of 15 to 24, which was very surprising to us. And I will return to this point later. First off, besides asking about frequency and how much time you spend on an average week, we also wanted to know about their preferred platforms. This is very central as well, because we have our own platform, of course. In most cases, which is not surprising as well, we see that podcast listeners use their phone to find new content, and they also use their phone to listen through headphones. And in most cases, we saw that the users are not single platform users. They use 1, 2, 3, or more. And 1 out of 4 podcast listeners in Denmark are actually willing to pay for a platform to be able to listen to unique content. So, the largest platforms in 2020 were Spotify, DR Sound, which is our own platform, YouTube, and Apple Podcast. These were the 4 largest platforms in 2020. And a lot has happened since then. Today, Spotify is by far the largest platform among Danish listeners. DR Sound has also grown, but not with the same rate. YouTube lost a surprisingly large part of a market share, reach among the Danish listeners, as well as Apple Podcast. And then we have the Danish player Podimo, which is the dark purple one, where 20% of the users of today actually find their content. So, large movement in the Danish market, where young listeners in particular drive the reach of Spotify, and the older segments by far drive the reach of DR Sound. Sorry? No, this is, do you use this platform? So we asked them, which of these services do you listen to when listening to podcast? Thank you. So overall, we have 2 hypotheses working with here. So first of all, the development of the Danish podcast market regarding content is either primarily driven by our competitors, or 2, we help this development of content, but the users have hard time actually ascribing this to our brand because they find our content on third-party platforms. Because DR is still the largest content creator, we are still the largest player regarding content on the Danish market. 43% of all users say they listen to content coming from us. However, this was the same number as in 2020. So that's an area for us to work with. And now I just want to circle back to the young listeners who apparently are very low frequent. So 63% of all young people in Denmark in the age between 15 to 24 listen to podcasts. The podcast medium is very established with this segment, or at least that's what we thought, because 38% of these listeners listen either every other week or on a monthly basis. That's the lowest frequent from all segments. Besides that, 46% of all young Danish podcast listeners say they spend less than an hour on an average week to listening to podcasts. This is the highest level among all segments. Only the mature adults, 40% of them say that they listen less than an hour on an average week. And why is that? So we asked the listeners whether or not they felt that the market served their audio appetite. And as you can tell from this graph, the replies were very different depending on age. So whereas the mature listeners felt that they were being overserved by all this amazing content that was available on the Danish market, the young Danish listeners said that they actually wanted to listen to more content, but they didn't find any content serving their needs or find content that was actually created for them. We also asked the listeners if you had any advice for DR, what would you want us to do differently? And 10% of the advice that we received was make more content for young listeners. And of course, we don't see this as a particular issue right now. We see it more as a potential. Also because we see that there's a large understream of young listeners who is joined in on the podcast medium since our last research. Yes. Another tier of this research circled around the states of needs with the Danish listeners. And it's very clear, as it was in 2020, that podcast time equals me time. So 82% listen while they're alone. 80% listen mainly when they're doing something else, while 72% listen while through their headphones connected to their phone. Commuting, grocery shopping, housekeeping, going on walks, exercising, relaxing among the common use situations. And it's very interesting just to see these patterns in the chart from our app. So when looking at when the users actually press play, this is divided by weekdays and weekend. You can kind of see the patterns of where the preferred user situation really come to play with the Danish audience. This is data from our own app, and it's not a flowchart depending on rating. It's within this hour how many average daily starts are there, if that makes sense. Oh, that's the wrong way. There you have it. Right. So to gain knowledge about how the podcast medium serve the users, we of course asked the users about their central needs. We saw that entertainment, immersion, captivation, relaxation, and knowledge was among the most important needs that podcasts can fulfill according to our listeners. The number of needs listed here in this graph was very challenging for me and Peter to grasp. So we asked ourselves, how can we detect some underlying patterns, some underlying motives to categorize these needs with our users? And at this point, Peter reached out to Mark Barber, the planning director of Radio Center, who presented to us a very useful model from he had developed surrounding commercial radio on the British market. Unfortunately, Mark couldn't attend Radio Days this year. However, I still wanted to thank him for showing us this model, because when looking at the central user needs that the Danish podcast listeners have, we found 6 clusters, or what he called these need states. And I really want to stress that this is Mark's model. These central user need states that the Danish listeners' needs were clustered in is keep me in the loop, help me escape, lift my mood, keep me company, provide social currency, and broaden my horizon. And not surprisingly, 3 of these need states are way more important than the other 3. So needs related to broaden my horizon, help me escape, and keep me company way heavier than the other 3. Now, this is quite complex, but I'll take you through it. So what we did was we took these 18 different needs that we asked our users about, and then we categorized them with Mark's model. What this graph shows is 2 axes. We have a vertical one that shows that spans from personal needs to social needs, and then we have a horizontal axis that spans from more content-related needs to context-related needs. So we're, of course, very well aware that not all needs necessarily is only applicable for one of these need states, but for instance, entertainment could be both lift my mood, help me escape, and keep me company as well. However, through discussions, we found where to place these needs, where we found that they were like primarily connected to. And what this map and overview can help us with is that we created some sort of a benchmark that for our portfolio, we can ask ourselves actively, like, how many podcasts did we actually create this year that were keep me in the loop, need states oriented? And do we see any gaps anywhere? And speaking of benchmarks, what you see here is the same data, but in a different graph. The green line shows the same data as before, the levels of how important these needs are to our users. We also asked whether or not they listened to DR content, our own content, and whether or not they felt that these needs were fulfilled with our content. So the red line is how the DR users see us. And if you answered that you didn't use DR content, we asked them, what's your perception of DR then? And as you can tell, the users, like the DR users, really find us very valuable at some of the very most important needs, and the non-users find us that their perception of us is that we don't fulfill any of the very important and central needs. So that's something for us to work with, and keep in mind that the non-DR users are primarily actually young listeners. So that's a focus we need to zoom in on, because it seems like you're more able to convince a listener to give it a try. Like, the more able you are to convince your listeners to give it a try, there's a larger potential that they will actually stick around. Because as Peter and Rasmus found in 2020, 2 out of 3 times that our podcast listeners put on a podcast, they already know. And why is this important for us to stress it? Because it shows how much of a habit medium the podcast really is. And that once you're over the hurdle and once you're in the fold, you have a tendency to stick around. However, not everyone finds something to listen to. And perhaps there is another side of this coin that will also be up for us to investigate. At the moment, we're working with a bounce rate of our podcast front page in DR Sound, our app, which indicates that 1 out of 5 potential listeners close the app without finding anything to listen to. And of course, in this amount, there's also people just, perhaps they're searching around the page for something to listen to later, but it's still very clear that we really need to be focused on what about the users who aren't in the 2 out of 3 times, and who's searching for new content. So, very, very, very relevant for us also to discuss the different ways that our users find new content. Not surprisingly, this also depends on age. Common to all segment is that word of mouth plays a very important role, as well as the usability of the podcasting app's browsing function. And we found that DR Sound is actually a really good app to browse for new content in. But in regards to media, the young listeners primarily find new content through social media, whereas the adult segments are even more accessible through traditional media outlets than the young listeners are. And now you see it. So overall, what this previous chapter taught us is that content fulfilling personal needs are central to our users. However, it's also very important for us to understand what parameters surrounding content are most important when clicking on new content. And by far, topic and genre is the most important to our listeners when searching for new podcasts to listen to. A good host and good quality sound today, though, seems to be a given. Since podcast has been formalized throughout the past years, and since it's such a habit medium and it's very well developed and matured, we wouldn't expect the users to stress that the sound have to have a certain quality, because of course the sound must be good. In Denmark, true crime is very important to the listeners. It has a very high reach. What you see is the dark spots show the 2020 level, where the columns show the levels of today. There are 2 dark blue columns that's categories that wasn't included in the previous overview. So today, 39% of the listeners actually listen to a podcast about true crime, where the level was 28% in 2020. Very interesting. Also very interesting to look upon the difference between the different age segments. So to us, what we see here is that the young listeners' usage is not remotely as diverse or as heavy as the other age segments, which makes sense since they have a low frequency and since they only listen for up to an hour on an average week. And just to highlight what the most important genres are with these audiences on each age segment. This top five shows us that, of course, true crime is presented on all these lists, but psychology and people is very important to our younger audience, whereas comedy and is also important. And to the youth, apparently these podcasts about me and my social relations are far more important to the young listeners than they are to the rest of these segments. A funny thing I've stumbled upon here is that news podcast is only presented with the oldest segment here. But society, however, which is broaden my horizon, is represented with all these segments. So on that note, I just want to follow up on our key insights. DR Sound has grown since our previous survey, but not at the same rate as the market, and we are to find out what this means. More young Danish people listen to podcasts today, but they need more content, and podcasts is still a habit medium today. So hopefully, if I see you again in a year or two, I'll tell you a story about how we found out that young listeners need content and how we then created a much more a much higher reach among this young audience. Thank you so much.
Tom, that's got to be the best presentation I've seen of the whole conference. Really good insights there. Please, Tom.
Good morning. All right, here we go. So Peter asked me to present something brand new for you today. He said, don't even come to Prague unless you have new research. It is true. And this is so new that we just put it out last week from Sounds Profitable. My partner Brian Barletta and I, representing Sounds Profitable here, we just put this out last week, so it still has that new research smell, which I understand is a mix of leather, whiskey, and a goat, I think. It's a heady stew. This project was called The Medium Moves the Message, and we wanted to examine how the medium, in this case we looked at broadcast AM/FM radio, broadcast linear television, network and cable television, and podcasts, looked at them together and looked at the influence of the medium upon the advertising for some of the most significant brands in the United States, the most frequent advertisers in the United States. Now, we chose these three media channels because they're all kind of in the same game. They're all in the same game of playing 30 to 60-second spots to try and capture attention, to transmit something meaningful from a brand to the audience, right? Display is not in that game. YouTube and their 5 seconds and skip ads are not in that game. Search is not in that game. So it's kind of apples to apples, or as they say here in Czech, apples to apples. What we did for this project was look at a sample of over 2,000 Americans 18 plus weighted to the census. We did not put any kinds of quotas on various kinds of listeners. We just looked at a representative sample of over 2,000 people. We asked them some questions about their media usage habits. We asked them questions about their response to advertising on these three very different media channels. And we also looked at some specific brands. We looked at the top 5 advertisers by share of voice, so the loudest, noisiest brands in each of the 3 channels, the top 3 advertisers by share of voice in broadcast radio, in linear television, and in podcasting, and I'll get to that a little bit later. But the first thing I want to touch on is just how much the audiences for these 3 very different mediums have changed over the past few years. And there's 3 things I want to point out about the podcast audience. Number 1, the podcast audience has been getting larger, right? It's obviously been getting larger year over year. You see that in multiple graphs. You've seen that in the data from DR. Number 2, it's getting younger, especially younger compared to the other 2 broadcast media that I'm going to discuss, and there's a very important reason for that. And number 3, it's getting more exclusive. The podcast audience is pulling away a little bit. And again, there are some reasons behind that. Now, there's a much longer version of this study at soundsprofitable.com, so I want to just touch on some of the highlights of this. First of all, the podcast audience is getting younger, and it's getting younger in a very specific way. This graph shows reach, the percentage of persons in each of these demographics that the listed media reaches. So if you look on the right, 55 plus, television reaches 74%, and this is weekly. All of this is weekly. Television reaches 74% of 55 plus every week. Podcasting, 14%. Clearly, a lot of opportunity there. It significantly underperforms 55 plus. But if you look on the left, the reach of podcasting is now getting almost equal to the reach of radio and television, and that is a remarkable statement. That is not a statement that we have been able to make thus far in the journey of podcasting. So the reach of podcasting is nearly equal to radio and TV, 18 to 34. Now, two things are happening with podcasting. Podcasting has had a big spike on the young end, largely driven by Spotify. And also, as you can see here, while it does underperform 55 plus, radio and TV are getting a little bit older. And so when you look at the composition of these three media, you'll see something quite remarkable. On the left is the US population. The average age of the US population is about 48. Thankfully, I'm above average in something. If you look at and for the rest of this, these are heavy users, really the top quintile of users in each of these, top quintile of listeners for podcasting, the heaviest listeners to radio, the heaviest viewers of TV. There is a full generation difference between them. The average age of the heavy users for TV is almost 59. That's the end of the baby boomer generation. The average age for the heavy users of podcasting is 37. That's squarely millennial. Gen X just gets skipped as usual. Nobody loves Gen X. There's a full generation difference. So the podcast audience is getting larger. Relative to the other two media, it's getting younger, and it's getting more exclusive. These graphs here, these two Venn diagrams, represent the portion of the podcast listening audience weekly that does not watch TV in an average week and does not listen to radio in an average week. And it's nearly 1 in 5 for each. So what's happening with the podcast audience? 10 years ago, if you bought TV, you were probably also getting podcast listeners. They were inside the circle of TV viewers. Same is true with radio. Those circles are pulling apart as we're getting younger, so that the podcast audience is now a segment of the population that's getting harder and harder to reach any other way, especially as you get younger, right? So there are brand impacts to all of this, and this study is primarily about brands and advertising. And I want to show you a couple of the top-level impacts of this, and then we can dive into the specifics of the brands that we looked at. Now, I've presented some version of this graph many times in the past. Do podcast listeners support the brands that support their favorite shows? And here we're comparing them to radio listeners who support their favorite radio shows or stations, and to television viewers, all weekly. How likely are they to support the brands that support their favorite TV shows? Now, this is the type of graph I've presented in the past. You see it's a pretty stark difference here. 60% of weekly podcast listeners say that they support the brands that support their favorite shows. That's quite a bit higher than you see for radio and television. So we know that there's more positive sentiment towards the advertising for podcasting. We also know that the ads on these media for podcasting, more people are likely to say they prompt a purchase than you see for radio and TV. So there's more positive sentiment here. So what's going on? What is behind these numbers? Why are podcast listeners a little bit more positive, in some cases significantly more positive, towards the brands that advertise and support their favorite shows? Well, some of that is due to the demographic effects that I showed you, which I'm going to touch on in just a moment. But I want to drill down into specifics. The two questions I just showed you are generalities. In general, how do you feel about the brands that support your favorite show? In general, are you likely to purchase products that you hear about in your favorite podcasts, TV shows, etc.? As I mentioned at the start, we looked at the top 5 brands by share of voice. Some of the finest brands we in America have to offer you, like McDonald's and Subway. You're welcome, Europe. In television, Domino's, Geico, Liberty Mutual, Progressive, those last three are all insurance companies, and Subway. For radio in the US, this is last year by share of voice, Indeed, ZipRecruiter, Progressive again, Upside, and Babbel. And for podcasting, we got this sourced from Magellan AI, BetterHelp, Shopify, Athletic Greens, Progressive again, and McDonald's. In fact, Progressive, Geico, Liberty Mutual, they're top at least 10 or 15 in everything. They just basically carpet bomb every channel. So they do show up in podcasting without a doubt. What we looked at for each brand were a series of 4 key brand health metrics. We looked at awareness. Are you aware of the brand? Favorability. And that's, are you very or somewhat favorable towards the brand? Sort of top 2 box in a 5-point scale. We asked consideration. Are you very or somewhat likely to use or purchase this brand in the future? And we also asked, did you, in fact, buy this, look online, purchase it? Did you take an action relative to this brand? Now, this is the top advertiser in television last year, Domino's. And what each of these sort of trios of bars represents, the dark blue bar on the left are people that did not watch TV in the last week. The middle bar are people that did watch TV in the last week. And the bar on the right, the orange bar, are heavy users, people who watched more than 20 hours of television in the last week. Now, there are some very key benefits here for television in awareness, right? The difference between those who did not watch TV last week and heavy viewers of TV for Domino's, 91% to 98%. It's a 7 percentage point difference. TV, I think we can determine, certainly had a contributing factor to driving some awareness for Domino's, which is already a fairly well-known brand. You see a little bit of an effect here for favorability, but what you also see for consideration and taking action, it's a little bit muddier as you go sort of heavier usage. You especially see this kind of pattern, and this is TV again, with the insurance companies who are the most active advertisers in the United States. Again, on the left, there is a huge difference here in awareness. It goes from 86% to 93%, pretty good for a brand most Americans already know. But when you look at consideration and especially took action, it actually goes down with heavy users. And this is a phenomenon that we have seen any number of times in all the brand lift studies that I've looked at. It represents potentially a bit of a backlash. People get tired of Progressive ads. People get tired of Geico ads. I've done a lot of work for one of those 3 insurance companies in podcasting. And it's absolutely true that there is a point at which people get saturated with ads for insurance companies and they start to react negatively to them. Now, this is in television. In radio, and again, all of these brands are available in the full study, which I encourage you to download. Radio looks fairly similar. Again, it draws a lot for awareness. There are definitely some impacts higher up in the funnel with favorability, and then it gets a little bit muddier as you get to things like consideration and taking action, which are lower in the funnel in that customer journey. Now I'm going to show you 2 podcasting brands, and these are 2 brands that are fairly important to podcasting. They are top 5 advertisers, they've spent a lot, and they are fairly exclusive to podcasting. They really don't advertise in other channels. The first is the top advertiser in podcasting last year, and that is BetterHelp. BetterHelp here, not a brand that a lot of people in the United States know outside of podcasting, but they are extremely active advertisers in podcasts. And so you can see that it has absolutely had a significant impact on awareness. 11% of people who did not listen to podcasts last week have heard of BetterHelp. Heavy listeners, over half have heard of BetterHelp. That's an enormous difference, right? Now that is, of course, I think, peculiar to a brand like BetterHelp, which is not active outside of podcasting, so they're not really well known. So you will see those kinds of increases in awareness. So that, I think, is just part of the brand and part of the brand's shadow and footprint in the United States. But again, as you go to the right, deeper in the funnel, favorability, awareness, consideration, taking action, multiples, 7, 8 times the percentage who are favorable, who have considered it and have taken an action than you see with non-podcast listeners. That's also true with another kind of native to podcasting advertiser, Athletic Greens. I had a delicious Athletic Greens this morning. This is not brought to you by Athletic Greens, but I am. So Athletic Greens is another advertiser that does not typically advertise outside of podcasting. Again, a massive increase in awareness. They're not well known outside of podcasting, but also significant increases, multiples of 12 and 13 for consideration and taking action. So podcasting with these brands has a significant impact, certainly middle and lower funnel, and obviously with awareness here because these brands aren't that well known, so you would expect to see some growth. Now that's with brands that are fairly exclusive to podcasting. But the incredible part of these findings is that we also saw these impacts, though not as dramatic, with brands that were heavy advertisers in other channels. And I mentioned the insurance companies, which are extremely active advertisers in the United States. When we looked at Progressive and Geico are heavy advertisers in all three channels, in podcasting, in broadcast radio, and in network cable television. This is with the exclusive audiences for each. So on the very left, you'll see the people who say, we watched TV last week, but we didn't listen to the radio or podcasts last week. And the same is true with the AM/FM only, that's radio, and podcast only on the right. And this is for consideration, the percentage who say that they are very or somewhat likely to use either of these two brands, Progressive and Geico. With the TV-only audience, you see 23% for Progressive and 19% for Geico. Go all the way to the right for podcasts, the podcast-only audience, it's approaching double that. And that's for the same brands, and these are brands that are advertising everywhere. And by the way, in the case of Progressive and Geico, they generally use the same audio creative that they use for broadcast radio. So it's not like you're getting these like massively engaging 3-minute host-read epic ads in the podcasts for Progressive and Geico. They do not allow that. You will take the gecko and you will like it if you advertise for Geico. So there's something else going on here that's driving some of these lower funnel measures that are significantly higher for podcasting. And there's a few factors that are involved. And it has to do not so much, we talk a lot about with podcasting the intimacy, the engagement, the sort of native to the medium impacts that happen between the earbuds. Those things are true, but I would suggest that they may be trailing variables of just simple demographic and behavioral changes in the audiences that are happening between podcast audiences and the audiences for broadcast radio and for broadcast television. The first thing that you can see right off the bat is when you ask this sample of 2,000 Americans, did you hear an ad or see an ad in each of these various channels in the last week? The podcast listener is the least likely to say that they have heard an ad in podcasts compared to the other channels. So number one, the channel itself is slightly less saturated with advertising. Many podcasts are completely ad-free, and those that aren't certainly have lower spot loads than, say, a typical commercial radio station in the United States does, where we are destroying listeners with spots in the United States, as you know. So the channel itself is less saturated. Another factor in that is that the listener to podcasts is much more likely to subscribe to premium on-demand services. And here we've got premium TV, streaming services that don't have ads, paid music services like Spotify Premium that don't have ads, and I threw in audiobooks as well, because audiobooks are also ad-free content, largely, although that is going to change, audiobook lovers. So all of these things factor into it, right? They're making, the listeners are less saturated with ads in their channels. They are hearing fewer ads in general, so they're not being destroyed by advertising. And then there are also some impacts just by age. You know that the podcast audience is significantly younger. This is the favorable opinion of each brand, the percentage who say that they are aware of each brand across the entire sample, who say that they have a favorable opinion of it. You'll see some of the podcast brands there on the bottom. This is with the entire sample. You'll look at Geico and Progressive at 46 or 49%, BetterHelp, Athletic Greens, 56, 59. This is 18 to 34. They're an average of 6 percentage points higher for all of the brands. They're less saturated with advertising. They are getting bombarded by fewer ads, and they are in general more positive and more malleable about all of these things. So all of this adds up to significant impacts here for podcasting in the middle funnel and the lower funnel, especially when it's accompanied with a broadcast buy. And I'll wrap things up here by just showing you a couple of really quick averages. We averaged the 5 TV brands for TV listeners, the 5 radio brands for radio listeners, and the 5 podcast brands for podcast listeners. And when you look at awareness, the differential for radio is 7%, for TV is 4%. For podcasting, it's 7%. That's driven a little bit by how little known the top brands are, so we can disregard that. Radio, incredibly important for building awareness here. And I'll skip forward to building action. Look at podcasts, right? So the real answer here is to sequence a radio buy and a podcasting buy. Use the radio buy to build reach. Use the podcasting buy sequenced to build middle and lower funnel activity to bring a listener all the way from knowing about a brand to considering it to potentially buying it. Those two things work together. They have an additive audience. They layer on top of each other, and I think represents a very powerful reason why broadcasters in Europe should pay more attention to podcasts as a complete audio solution for advertisers. All of these are available at soundsprofitable.com. Peter, I thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you all very much for your kind attention.
You're so wonderful. You're so wonderful. He's so wonderful. This was great. 2 best presentations for the whole conference. I mean, wow. We've gone over a little time, but I thought you'd rather have me wring the last, bits of knowledge out of these people. But if there's one question, maybe 2, if you dare ask these renowned intellectuals. No? No questions? Coffee? Coffee it is. Thank you very much.